Hello, my name is Dr. Susan Blank, and I'm an endocrinologist who works with the Virginia Department of Health. Thank you for joining me for today's learning session, which is part of the Virginia Healthy Hearts Initiative. We'll be talking about ultra-processed food, why we eat so much of it, and how it affects our health. Let's get started. We're going to start by defining what we mean by ultra-processed food, then move on to discuss the rise of ultra-processed food, the effects of ultra-processed food on our heart health, and then we're going to finish up with some tips on how to reduce the ultra-processed food in our diets. The official definition of ultra-processed foods comes from something called the NOVA classification system, and this is a classification system that divides foods into 4 different categories depending on their level of processing. The first category is NOVA 1, which is unprocessed or minimally processed foods. So these foods can be whole or they can be cut up or frozen, but nothing additional can be added to them. So this would include things like fresh fruits and vegetables, eggs, milk, and meat. The next category is NOVA 2, which is processed culinary ingredients. So these are things like salt, olive oil, flour, butter that are made through some level of processing, but they're only for cooking and they're not eaten directly. The third category, or NOVA 3, is processed foods, but these are foods that are processed only using simple traditional techniques, things like canning and pickling and smoking. And it includes things like canned fruits and vegetables, traditionally made cheeses, and homemade bread. The fourth category, which we're going to be focusing on today, is NOVA 4, or the ultra-processed foods. These are industrial formulations made using chemically modified ingredients. It includes a wide variety of foods, including soft drinks, hot dogs, commercial baked goods, and chips. An easier definition for ultra-processed foods is that these are foods that contain 1 or more ingredients that would not be found in a home kitchen. And there's some other tip-offs that things may be ultra-processed. One is that your great-grandparents wouldn't recognize it as food. Another is that it might have a long list of ingredients. I like to use over 5 as a cutoff here. And it also may have ingredients in it that you cannot pronounce. I think it's helpful to go through a few examples, especially to learn how to distinguish between processed foods and ultra-processed foods. So here's the first example. A tomato is unprocessed, tomato sauce is processed, and canned spaghetti would be considered ultra-processed. Corn on the cob is unprocessed, canned corn is processed, and high fructose corn syrup and soda is considered ultra-processed. A whole fresh chicken breast is unprocessed, while dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets are ultra-processed. Now that you understand the definition of ultra-processed food, we're going to move on and talk about the rise of ultra-processed food in the American diet. These charts look at the percentage of total caloric intake that's coming from ultra-processed foods. And as you can see, it's quite high. It's over half at 53% for American adults, and even more at 62% for American children. There's actually a very interesting history of how we got to this point. Up until the late 1800s, diets consisted primarily of whole foods or foods that were treated with some traditional techniques, including drying, salting, smoking, and canning, that were used to improve taste and also shelf life. And these initial processing techniques were quite beneficial. They made the food supply safer and also allowed people to put away food for seasons when food was less plentiful. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, along with the Industrial Revolution, we start to see the industrialization and mass production of some foods. And this is when some brands that are still very popular today, including Coca-Cola, Jell-O, and Oreos, were introduced. And you can see some of their original ads here, which is kind of fun. In the 1940s, there was a rapid expansion of industrialized food processing as products were being developed and mass produced in order to serve the soldiers on the front lines in World War II. After the war was over in the 1950s and 60s, manufacturers realized that they could market these same foods as convenience foods to the general population. This also coincided with a time when a lot of women were entering the workforce, and there was a lot of interest in foods that took less time to prepare. In the 1970s and 1980s, secondary to improvements in fertilizer and farm subsidies, there was a large excess of corn and wheat crops. Processes were developed in order to turn these crops into cheap industrial ingredients, including things like high fructose corn syrup, vegetable oil, and modified starch. This is a time where there was also a lot of increase in television advertising for food, especially towards children. And as a result, high fructose corn syrup intake by American children increased 100-fold between 1970 and 1993. In the 1990s and early 2000s, some tobacco companies diversified into the ultra-processed food industry and brought new tactics with them. They engineered foods to be highly craveable to keep people coming back for more. They employed aggressive marketing tactics, including specifically targeting children with things like cartoon characters and toy giveaways, because they understood that children were more susceptible to marketing, and also that if they could get a kid hooked on a product young, they could build brand loyalty and have a customer for life. And they also used lobbying and litigation to try to block any regulation. And by the 2010s, over 70% of the products on US grocery store shelves were ultra-processed. It's important to understand that ultra-processed foods are industrial products that are highly engineered for hyperpalatability and to encourage overconsumption. You may really like fruit or enjoy a steak from time to time, but you're very unlikely to binge on either one of those. And that's partially because in nature, we find that there are some foods that are high in sugar, like fruits, which contain a lot of natural sugar, and some foods that are high in fats, including meat and nuts, but it's very unusual to find the combination of sugar and fat together. And very few, if any, naturally occurring foods are high in salt. But the food companies realized that they could use precise combinations that are not often found in nature, so they could combine sugar and fat, salt and fat, or use a trifecta of sugar, salt, and fat, and that these combinations trigger the reward pathways in the brain and keep people coming back for more and more and more. They also engineer the foods not only to taste good, but for the entire experience of eating them. So they think about look, smell, the way they feel in your mouth, the texture, the sound of the crunch when you eat a chip. The natural food matrix is often disrupted with removal of fiber, which decreases the feeling of fullness, so people will eat more of these types of foods. And often the foods are engineered to be softer or liquid, because this way they can be taken in more quickly and people can consume more before triggering sensations of fullness. Ultra-processed food is big business, and a lot of time and effort and resources go into making these foods as appealing as possible. As we've seen, they're highly engineered to be delicious. They also tend to be relatively affordable, in part because of the reliance on cheap industrial ingredients. They're designed to save time and effort in food preparation, and that convenience can be really helpful for busy families trying to get food on the table. They are shelf stable, which makes them easy to store and unlikely to spoil. That can be great for families, but it can also be really helpful for stores, and is part of the reason why these foods are so widely available. They're found not just in grocery stores and big box stores, but also in convenience stores and gas stations all over the place. Because of this, sometimes they can be really the only form of food that can be found in lower income areas and rural places where there may not be a full service grocery store with all the fruits and vegetables and fresh meats. These foods are also incredibly heavily and aggressively marketed. Just last year, the food and beverage industry spent over $14 billion in advertising. Now we're going to move on and discuss the impact of ultra-processed foods on heart health. There are several features of ultra-processed foods which make high levels of consumption concerning for heart health. The first is that these products tend to be very high in added sugars, sodium, and saturated fats. These contribute to the incidence of diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol, respectively. They also tend to be low in fiber, which we know is important for heart health, and they're very calorie dense, which means that bite for bite, you're getting more calories, which can contribute to weight gain. And even though they tend to be high in calories, they tend to be low in nutrients, including vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants that are usually found in whole foods and that we know are important for heart health. There's also possible risk from chemical exposure to ingredients like artificial dyes, flavorings, and preservatives, as well as exposure to chemicals included in food packaging. And it's hard to know at this point how bad, if at all, a lot of these additives are for us, but even if they're entirely safe, they're not adding any nutritional value, so why eat them and take on any potential additional risk? It's difficult to do randomized controlled trials for ultra-processed foods, but what we can do is look at various levels of ultra-processed food intake and their association with cardiovascular risk factors and disease. And when we do this, there's strong evidence that high ultra-processed food intake is associated with increased risk of obesity, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, cardiovascular disease and mortality, specifically coronary heart disease and mortality. So this would include heart attacks, cerebrovascular disease and mortality, that would include strokes, and all-cause mortality. So even though these associations are just associations and don't necessarily prove that ultra-processed food is the cause of the higher risk of these things, it is certainly concerning. Here is some data from one of the few randomized controlled trials that has been done on ultra-processed foods, and it's a really important and interesting study. What they did was they had 20 adults live in a controlled research environment for about a month, and they compared the ultra-processed food diet to an unprocessed food diet. Each participant was given both diets for 14 days in random order, so some of the people would have gotten the ultra-processed diet first, others would have gotten the unprocessed diet first, and then they switched. And the diets that the participants were offered were matched for calories, energy density, macronutrients, sugar, sodium, fat, and fiber. So they really tried to keep everything else consistent and isolate the difference between unprocessed foods and ultra-processed foods. And the participants could eat as much as they wanted of whatever diet they were on. And we can see the results over here on the left. The top chart looks at the calorie intake. The bottom chart looks at the change in body weight, and these are done over the 14 days that people were on each diet. The blue lines look at the ultra-processed food diet, and the red lines look at the unprocessed diet. So if we look at the calorie intake, we can see that consistently the people on the ultra-processed diet took in more calories, and it ended up being an average of 508 more calories a day over the 14 days when they were on the ultra-processed diet. And if we look at the weight gain change, we can see that the people on the ultra-processed diet did tend to gain weight over the course of the 14 days. They gained just under a kilogram or around 2 pounds, while the people on the unprocessed diet lost around the same amount of weight. They lost close to 2 pounds. So this study has some limitations. There are only 20 people in it, obviously, and it was short term with just 14 days on each diet, but it is very important and shows that there does seem to be a real difference between unprocessed foods and ultra-processed foods, and that the ultra-processed food does seem to lead to higher caloric intake and also weight gain, and both of those could potentially have negative effects for heart health if they extended out for longer. Because of the increasing body of evidence on the health risks of ultra-processed foods, in 2026, for the first time, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommended limiting the intake of highly processed foods. Now that we've discussed some of the health risks associated with ultra-processed foods, let's move on and discuss some tips to reduce our intake of them. It is unrealistic for most of us to entirely cut out all ultra-processed foods, but what we can do is try to gradually shift the balance of our diet away from ultra-processed foods and towards whole, unprocessed foods and minimally processed foods. And I want to acknowledge here that this is very difficult in our current food environment, and that it's going to be more challenging for some people than others given lack of time or financial resources or even access to healthy foods. But try to find a few small steps that you can take in this direction and then build on your successes. Reducing our intake of ultra-processed foods starts by prioritizing whole, unprocessed foods. And we can set ourselves up for success at the grocery store. By shopping primarily the outer edges of the grocery store, this is where stores tend to keep their produce and dairy and meat, and only go down those central aisles of the grocery store where they keep most of the ultra-processed foods if you're looking for specific things. When you buy processed foods, you want to read labels and choose ones that have only short ingredient list, where the ingredients on them are things that could be found in a home kitchen. That way, hopefully you'll be getting primarily processed foods and not ultra-processed foods. Choose water as your go-to drink. Prepare food at home when you can. When you cook, you have control over what you're putting in your food. And when you do eat out, choose restaurants where most of the food is made from scratch, and choose meals with ingredients as close to their natural state as possible. You're better off with a grilled chicken breast than chicken nuggets. I want to take a couple of minutes and specifically address some of the major reasons why people tend to default towards ultra-processed foods. And these include taste, cost, and convenience. And we're going to start with taste. So first of all, there are so many delicious unprocessed whole foods out there to eat. Think about a delicious, fresh, juicy peach in the summer, or a big salad filled with all kinds of different colors and textures, or a delicious piece of grilled fish or meat with fresh herbs. You really just need to experiment and find the ones that you enjoy. And once you've found them, I think it's really helpful to think in terms of the healthy, delicious whole foods that you want to eat more of, instead of focusing on the foods that you're limiting. If you're eating more of the whole unprocessed foods, you're naturally going to have less room for the ultra-processed foods in your diet. And I think that the positive framing can really help. And lastly, believe it or not, your palate will gradually adjust to and come to enjoy lower levels of added sugar and salt. If you go back to some of the foods that you're enjoying now that are ultra-processed and try them again in 2 or 3 months after you haven't been eating them as frequently, you may find that they're too salty and too sweet for you now. Here we look at some of the most popular categories of ultra-processed foods and make some suggestions for unprocessed or minimally processed alternatives. Savory snacks is a huge category. If you're in the mood for chips, maybe try some unsalted nuts, air-popped popcorn, or some cut-up crunchy vegetables like carrots or celery sticks or bell peppers. If you're in the mood for sweets, fresh fruit is always a great option. Some people really enjoy frozen fruit like bananas and grapes. You can make a smoothie with fruit and maybe a little bit of yogurt, or homemade baked goods. If you're in the mood for baked goods, homemade baked goods are always going to be healthier than commercial baked goods. For drinks, water should be your go-to drink. Milk and unsweetened coffee or tea are also good options. Breakfast foods are another time when many of us rely on ultra-processed foods because we're busy and tired and in a hurry in the mornings. Instead of sugary cereal, you can go for oatmeal with fruit. You can make overnight oats to make it a little bit more convenient. Plain yogurt with fruit and maybe a little bit of a honey, it's going to be better than a processed flavored yogurt. And vegetable omelets and avocado on whole grain bread would be other good breakfast alternatives. Cost and affordability are very important, and a lot of people worry about their ability to follow a diet that's high in whole unprocessed foods on a budget, but there are some tips for doing this. As far as fruits and vegetables, when you're buying fresh, it's helpful to try to buy them in season. That's when they tend to be the cheapest and also the tastiest. You also want to look for some types of produce that tend to be well priced year round. These include things like bananas, apples, broccoli, carrots, cucumbers, and celery. Frozen fruits and vegetables can be a great option. These are picked at the peak of their ripeness. They're often prepared and cut up for you already and then frozen, and they tend to be very affordable. Canned versions are also another good option. They're more processed than frozen, but still not ultra processed. You just want to look for vegetables that are packaged without any additional salt being added and fruits that are packed in 100% juice. Beans and lentils can be a great inexpensive source of protein. And if you have the storage space, consider buying in bulk. You can portion it out and even freeze some of it, and that's a way to get the overall cost down. Convenience is another reason why a lot of us rely on ultra-processed foods, and here are a few tips for dealing with that. For vegetables and fruits, which require some degree of preparation, one idea is to do that when you first bring them home from the grocery store. You can wash them and chop them up and put them into containers in the refrigerator, and that way they'll be ready when it's time to cook or if you're looking for an easy snack. And if you put them at eye level in the refrigerator, you'll actually be surprised at how often your family will choose them as a go-to snack when they're looking for something to eat. You can also buy washed greens and pre-chopped vegetables and fruits at a lot of grocery stores. These may be a little bit more expensive, but it may be worth it to you for the trade-off in convenience. You can also use frozen or canned versions, which can help eliminate some of the prep time. If you're organized, you can batch prepare meals in advance for the week. A lot of people especially like to do this with lunches that they can bring with them to work. And you can also consider making your own frozen dinners. This is something that I like to do with things like casseroles and soups that freeze really well. When I'm making them, I'll just double the recipe, and then I can freeze half of it to pull out on a busy night for an easy meal. Now that we've talked about how to reduce ultra-processed foods in our individual diets, I want to shift and talk a little bit about how we can decrease ultra-processed foods in our community. You can start always by leading by example. If people see you eating delicious-looking meals that are full of whole, unprocessed foods, you may inspire them to do the same. Share and educate. Talk to your family and friends about the risks of ultra-processed foods and some strategies to try to reduce their intake. You could also help organize heart-healthy activities. Things like cooking classes, community gardens, and produce distribution can encourage people to eat more whole, unprocessed foods. And lastly, advocate for change. You can help support policies for things like healthy food access, reducing ultra-processed foods in school meals, and restricting food marketing to children that can help make healthier living easier for everyone. This concludes today's learning session. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you've gained some understanding about ultra-processed foods and how they affect our health. Until next time, take good care of yourselves and each other.